All right, welcome back. Hope you didn't have too much of a challenge working with that certificate management lab. Let's move on to an interesting new feature added to vSphere 7. This is called the vCenter Server Identity Federation. In this lesson, we're going to describe identity federation, recognize use cases for identity federation, describe the architecture of identity federation, and configure identity federation. So what does this all mean? Well, with vCenter Server, you already know probably that when you log into vCenter Server, there's actually an embedded identity provider that provides the single sign-on services, generates a token for a user once they log into vCenter Server. This token is then passed on to all the other vCenter servers that may be linked together in enhanced link mode. But that's all part of the embedded identity provider that you have within the vCenter system, or in previous versions of vSphere, it was something that was actually embedded in the platform service controller. So in any case, that embedded identity provider could let you authenticate with an embedded directory service known as vSphere.local, but it could also let you authenticate with Active Directory. It also could have you directly or authenticate with OpenLDAP. So the thing is, though, the options for authentication are limited to what the identity provider can perform on that system, which normally is nothing more than a username and password, or a smart card authentication, or by simply passing on whatever Windows credentials you used on the system that you're logged into, that you're running your browser on, to then connect to vCenter. You can forward on your Windows credentials onto the system, right? Onto the single sign-on system here. Well, with this identity provider being handled externally, making use of the AD federated services, this is a very interesting difference, right? This authentication now handles the user's credentials, not the embedded identity provider that you have normally. It also is going to create the initial identity token, and this also means that vCenter no longer is managing or updating the user and group information on the identity source, right? So this is an interesting change. What I find makes this even more compelling is that you may have other authentication method requirements besides name and password or smart card. There may be other options. So you're able to leverage whatever your ADFS provider is providing instead. So we'll just do this using the Active Directory Federated Services as the primary and only external identity provider at this point in time in your vSphere environment. So you can either use the embedded identity provider using the traditional methods that we've been using to authenticate, whether that's authenticating with the vSphere.local or with AD or OpenLDAP, with the external identity provider providing AD's federated services. You're going to be authenticating with AD, of course, and no other identity source. But also, you can still use the embedded identity provider for anything that's internal on the vCenter system, such as vSphere.local. So the use cases are that when using single sign-on with the existing ADFS integrated infrastructure and applications, but for also improving data center security, because vCenter Server never has to handle the credentials any longer. You can put all of the credential handling mechanisms in the identity, as part of the ADFS implementation, right? When using authentication mechanisms that are supported by that external identity provider, like we mentioned, you're not limited to just the authentication methods that the embedded vCenter identity provider can handle. You're able to leverage whatever the external identity provider, in this case ADFS, can provide. So that means you've got a lot of flexibility in letting your organization's security requirements be fulfilled with whatever your ADFS is utilizing. So the components that make up this whole identity provider federation components, you obviously need everybody running on vSphere 7, right? vCenter Server needs to be running vSphere 7. Of course, you'll need to have an identity provider service that is configured on vCenter. So you'll need to tell vCenter you're using an external identity provider. You'll need an ADFS server and associated Microsoft AD domain, since you are going to be logging into AD here. And the way how the ADFS functions, you'll need to set up on the ADFS system what's called an application group. An application group basically specifies the URI of the vCenter server with a client ID that you'll use to represent the vCenter server, so that when users are being redirected over to the ADFS, those are going to be handled through a trusted connection. In fact, you'll need to make sure the certificate of the ADFS is also trusted in your environment too. So that needs to be all done on the ADFS, right? Creating an application group that is leveraging the URI of the vCenter server, right? And we'll show you how you gather all this information. And of course, you'll need to have AD groups in your vCenter server's permissions, so that when users are logging into vCenter, they're not just users that are part of the administrator at vSphere.local type of user account. You'd have to log into some account that's, part of an AD domain, and that user would need to have permissions on that vCenter system, or more likely, an AD group is going to have permissions on your vCenter system. The prerequisites are that you'll need to be running ADFS for Windows Server 2016 R2 or later. ADFS must be connected to AD, and that application group needs to be for vCenter must have been created on the ADFS as part of the configuration process. So again, there are some things that you'll need to do on the ADFS side, such as create that application group, which then requires to have the vCenter server's URI in its implementation. That will generate what's called a client ID with a secret key. You'll then use those elements in setting up the external identity provider on vCenter. And again, the ADFS server certificate should be signed and trusted by a trusted certificate authority. So thinking about how it normally works, right? When you first log into a vCenter server using the embedded identity provider, right? You've got your traditional vSphere client who logs into vCenter server, right? You point your browser to the vCenter server URL. Well, vCenter server already knows, okay, the identity provider is the internal identity provider. Now, in vSphere 6, it used to be in the platform service controller. So you'd basically watch the browser. You'd get a redirect. So the browser will have to do a reconnect over to the web SSL URL that represents the embedded identity provider. In vSphere 6, that would have gone to the platform service controller. In vSphere 7, that goes right back to the same vCenter system. It's just a slightly different address in the URL that goes to the web SSO URL based. Now that identity provider will then go through the authentication, whether you're logging into the vSphere.local domain, so it's local to the vCenter server's users, or the authentication is coming with Active Directory. Well, the identity provider is going to provide that, right? And again, the options you have for credentials and authentication methods is by using username and passwords, or possibly with smart card reader. And then that's really about it. Once authenticated, the token is then passed back to the client, and then the user will now log into the vCenter server with that token being provided by the identity provider service. And if you have enhanced link mode, would have passed that login process with the token across all the vCenter systems. We'll come back after a break here and take a look at what are the steps in configuring the whole identity provider service as an external ADFS. So we'll come back after taking a quick break.